The crowns of the Egyptian gods. This is my explanation of the crowns of the Egyptian gods based on my own understanding. To understand the origins of these so-called gods, it will enable you to understand the meaning and importance of both the crowns and also the animalistic representation of that god, and even the symbols of their godliness. So first of all, I want to make it clear that the gods were not real. Well, not real in the sense of being supernatural beings, but part of the evolutionary process of these gods may have in fact been kicked off by the odd real person, i.e., they represented people who might at some stage have lived among them. So people who would have been from my culture of my dream regressions, the Atlanteans, or were just normal people from their culture, well, normal as in maybe pharaohs or great warriors. And my people were really just normal people as well, but with technology. And to the ancient Egyptians, that was magic, and hence they were gods. To really understand these gods, let's start at the beginning. The Egyptian deities were originally not as numerous as they became over the thousands of years of their activity. Initially, they each epitomized a single primary aspect of the world. This is because the origin of these gods was nature worship. For instance, Ra was the deity of the sun, while Nut the sky, etc. Classical, natural things that people could relate to. This natural god structure was adapted over time and enhanced as new gods were added or old gods were amalgamated, sometimes together and sometimes with real people who became deified. Some of these deified individuals came from within their own societal structure, for example, men, while others were the people of an ancient civilization that we know today as Atlantis, and you will hear me often refer to them as the Ancient Ones in many of my episodes. Over thousands of years of ancient Egypt's existence, the gods, as I said, evolved and some merged. Gods usually had both human and animal representations, some even having multiple animal representations, like Thoth, or as I knew him, Tehut. And these animal representations had specific qualities recognized of that animal for that person, or should I say for that god. The headdress also denoted specific traits that were particular to a god. So the animal forms and the headdresses were simply a way to communicate the attributes of the god. The god's personalities, as myths tell us, were often unpredictable and not always good, but most were well disposed towards their people. Certain deities were vindictive and needed appeasement. Others, like Neith, Sekhmet, and Mut, had fluctuating personalities. Seth, the deity who assassinated his brother Osiris, personified the malicious and the chaotic facets of the world. But his story, from my dream regressions, differs quite a lot from the story told in these myths, but I think I'll leave that one for another day. The physical embodiment of the diverse Egyptian deities typically amalgamated human and animal features, with many associated with one or more animal species, as I said. An animal could also symbolize a deity's temperament. For example, a deity could be depicted as a ferocious lion when angry, or a cat when gentle. The tradition was to illustrate the animal deities with a human body and an animal head. Conversely, a king might be depicted with a human head and a lion's body, as exemplified by the Sphinx. Sphinxes could also be portrayed with other heads, especially those of rams or falcons or, well, they varied. Numerous deities were solely represented in human forms. These included such ancient figures as the cosmic god Shu of the air, Geb of the earth, Min, the fertility god, and Ptah, the craftsman. There were also several minor gods that assumed unusual forms, such as Bes and Tawat. It is further complicated by the gods evolving separately for a time from their actual source. So they had an evolutionary process, and then they split their evolution into evolving in Upper Egypt and separately evolving in Lower Egypt. And it created some differences between the gods. But when they later amalgamated and returned into one religion, so to speak, by that I mean that they were later returned to a combined pantheon. So some merged as gods and others as individuals. So a good example of such are the gods Pe and Nekhen that relate to the regions of ancient Egypt. So basically Pe and Nekhen were two of the most important regions of ancient Egypt, and they were associated with two different gods. So Pe was associated with the god Osiris, and he was the god of the underworld, judge of the dead, you know. Nekhen was associated with Horus, and he was the god of the sky and the protector of pharaohs. So the two regions were also seen as representing the two halves of Egypt, one the southern region and the other the northern region. However, over time, the political unification of Egypt and the religious beliefs being blended, those gods of Upper and Lower Egypt were often combined. An example of this is like Amun-Ra is a combination of the god Amun and Ra. So understanding the symbology of Egyptian gods is a bit like reading an ancient comic book. Each god representing a different character or theme, a bit like superheroes with their own unique powers and backstories. And like Superman, he stands for hope and justice and doing all the right things. Ra, too, had similar attributes, but in particular, he symbolized creation and life. The symbols used, like the Ankh or the Eye of Horus, are akin to the iconic logos for a specific group or deity. A bit like Batman's bat symbol, giving each god a distinct identity and a set of powers. So just as comic books use visual elements to convey complex narratives, the symbology of Egyptian gods does actually tell a rich and intricate story about both the gods as well as the culture and beliefs that the Egyptian ancients lived with. So to summarize, yes, some gods were based on real people, and some of those people were from the ancient Egyptian culture, but some were not. Some were from the ancient ones, i.e. Atlantis. But not all gods were real people originally. Many of the gods were nature gods, because the gods in fact started as nature gods and evolved from there and were added to by the creation of gods for a real person, and just made it a little bit more interesting and complex. And then along the way, some gods got merged and some evolved separately in separate areas into two completely different gods. But the attributes and the emotions of the gods were communicated through their form, their headdresses, and their symbols. So that was the crowns, the animal bodies, and the various symbols associated with that god. So when we see the headdresses of the gods, they truly are just symbolic. They never existed. And when a pharaoh is depicted wearing a god's crown or headdress, it usually just means he or she is claiming the attributes of that god. And in some cases, they were claiming to be the incarnation of that god even. When a god is wearing the crown of a royal, so i.e. a real crown, it means that that god is part of the ruling of the country and is supporting the pharaoh. There are some god crowns that are very popular to be depicted on a pharaoh. For example, the feathered crown called the Atif. But it never existed. At least I never saw it. It's popular because it's so similar to a real crown, the white crown. But also it's because it was the crown of Osiris. And hence, he was a big favorite, so the crown was a big favorite. This episode has taken a long time to get out, and the reason is that I wrote literally about 25 pages on this subject, but it turned out to be long, drawn out and boring, and so I decided to cut it down to the really key, interesting bits. I mean, I could talk about the various gods individually, and I could talk about which ones may have been a representation of a real person at one point, but it would have been a very long episode. And some people even think that these pictures of animal-human hybrids were real, that they were walking around. They weren't. They were pure symbology. And no, the nearest thing to a human-animal hybrid walking around really was just when people dressed up as such in order to celebrate a game called the Game of Herds. But that's another story. There's so much more I could say about each crown. I could even describe the influence of the separation of the crowns, of the gods, and the combination of the gods when Upper and Lower Egypt came back together and how it affected the evolution of those gods. But that too, that would have got a bit boring. So I scratched that out of the speech. So I've kept it simple, and I've just described the symbology around the crowns of the gods from a generic perspective. So I'm going to leave it at that, but if you have any questions, please ask me and I'll do my best to answer.